Today we're going to be looking at all the types in the game and ranking them on how strong I believe they are in Draft League. Before we get anywhere, make sure to go check out J Ricky and Gentleman Thomas. Their video ranking the tiers is the inspiration for this one, so make sure to go check them out. And of course, with every other tier list, this is my opinion. If you have different opinions, by all means share down below in the comments section, but be constructive about it. Let's have some actual conversation instead of just shit talking each other. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead, get straight into this. Bug. We'll be going into Bug. It is just the worst type, and it had to have its own tier because it is that bad. It is resisted by everything in the game, and that is hyperbole. It's only slight hyperbole, like fairy, fighting, fire, flying, ghost, poison, steel. Like, there's some of the best types in the game. Like, literally it's resisted by fairy, steel, ghost and poison, which arguably are like 4 of the top tier types in the game, or like at least like the most prevalent ones. So yeah, terrible typing. Yes, it's nice to be able to hit those dark types, and U-turn is a great stab. Sticky web is something that is almost exclusive to bug types, so there is that as well, but it really doesn't make up for the fact that it is a absolutely horrendous typing in both offensive and defensive capabilities. It's just at the bottom. It needs something. And for the most part, unless you pick up like a Scizor or a like a Low Kicks or a Volcarona, there's no reason to pick up a bug type. And even then, like, Volcarona's draft usage I think has fallen off a cliff since like Gen 6. Pretty much since Boost came in. For some reason Volcarona has gotten worse. But the reason those mons are good is because of their secondary types or their utility, not because they're bug type. Next up we've got Dark, and Dark is actually a really good type in this generation. Resistances to Dark and Ghost, as well as that immunity to Psychic. Very handy to have. Its weaknesses, realistically, Bug doesn't count, so it's only really weak to Fairy and Fighting. Okay, it's weak to U-turn, but defensively it just offers you so much, and I think Dark and Ghost being so good this generation as well means that having this defensive dark type, or at least a dark type, to be able to stop Shadow Ball spam, to be able to prevent knockoff spam to an extent, is always going to be really helpful to have. Speaking of knockoff, stab knockoff is the best knockoff, and knockoff is arguably the most spammable move in the game. I think it's up there with the likes of Earthquake, it's up there with Moonblast, it's up there with Scald. I think at this point in the metagame, dark types are something you should always have. And next up we have Dragon, and honestly, Dragon used to be god tier. It used to be up here. However, I think it has fallen off. I would put it probably towards the top of useful, because I think defensively it's still an amazing type. Still one of the best types in the game in terms of defensive capabilities, because albeit it's weak to Fairy, the other two types, Dragon and Ice, are a little bit less prominent. But it's those elemental resists that are the big ones, electric, fire, grass, water, and offensively it's only checked by fairy and steel types. For the most part, every dragon type will get something to hit at least one of those types, most of them getting earthquake to be able to hit the steel types. But I think just dragon in general, granted, not as good as it used to be back in Gen 5, it used to be the god tier of all god tiers. Dragon is still a very strong type. A lot of people are starting to say that it's a little bit less necessary, but I think just getting those 4 resists are so helpful to every team. Next up we've got Electric, and I think Electric is useful to have, I think just mainly because of being able to volt switch spam is always going to be helpful. It's only weak to ground as well, so defensively it's a really solid typing, great resists in Electric, Flying and Steel, 3 of which you'll very commonly see in draft. But of course, like, it not being able to hit ground types really does affect some of them, likes of Regieleki, the likes of Jolteon, 2 that just come to mind immediately. Cannot deal with those ground types particularly well. It's outside of that, the only resists being Dragon, Electric and Grass, all of which can be volt switched on very easily. As somebody who didn't draft a ground type for one season of BBR back in the day, I can tell you, having a ground type, or not having a ground type, and every team having an electric type, just meant that every time you were facing like Specs Volt Switch or Scarf Volt Switch, depending on what your team was weaker against, it was painful. So I think electric type, if going unchecked, is one of the best types in the game, just because of its ability to hit so many different things, and also the water type being super effective against water types in a generation where water type is so good. It's going to be a big bonus. It's probably the best of the 2 types that is going to be able to hit those water types, so yeah, it goes into useful. I think you most of the time want to draft one. Next up, we have, to no one's surprise, the first god tier type in Fairy. Fairy is ridiculous. Not only because of its weaknesses being only poison and steel, still lacks the offensive capabilities of really being able to deal with Fairy too much. Plus, they're mostly physically defensive, and Fairy is mostly specially defensive. So Moonblasts, being the most broken ass fucking move in the game, is always going to put a dent in your steel type. Poison types are much better this gen, so that is the one thing that Fairy really does struggle against. I guess fire types as well. Just that resist to Fairy for fire is huge. Fairy hits the majority of the game for neutral damage and hits really hard. Play Rough and Moonblast, physical and special side, you've got a very good stab move. A lot of the Fairy types are either very bulky or have great stats in general, so they've already got that buff. And Fairy just being able to be immune to Dragon, it resists Dark, it resists Fighting, two very, very good types in the metagame as well. Fairy is just that step above a lot of the other types in the game. And I think every draft wants a Fairy, and you want to kind of spend a bit bigger on your Fairy for the most part, because you don't want to be left with, like, I mean, I'm not going to shit talk Carbink, but you don't want to be left with Carbink or the Dene or something like that as your Fairy type for your draft. Next we've got Fighting, and Fighting to me is actually a really good type. It's actually a little bit weaker, I think, offensively than it ever used to be, but at the same time I still think maybe it goes to the top of useful actually. It's mainly just the bias of the fighting types they introduced in this gen are nuts. Annihilate, Iron Hands, Great Tusk, Iron Valiant, just to name a few off the top of my head, are all really, really strong mons. And I think, like, you see those and you immediately think, oh wow, fighting's a great type. In terms of what it can actually hit, it can't hit ghost types, albeit knockoff on fighting types is quite common. Bug doesn't count. Fairy, Flying, Poison, Psychic, there's a few very prominent types in that list. However, its offensive capabilities to be able to hit dark types and steel types in particular is really, really nice. Close combat is pretty spammable, and there's a plethora of good priority moves as well in that fighting category that you can use to your advantage. I think fighting types, possibly I put them a little bit high. Maybe they do go behind like Dragon and Electric, but I still think like the top tier fightings are so unbelievably cracked. It might not be because of the fighting type, but the fighting type doesn't hurt, especially offensively. Next up we got Fire, and I think I'm probably in the minority here, but I think Fire is a fantastic typing. If you look at the things that it resists, it's actually so helpful. And I think a Fire type goes up into useful. Being able to resist the main ones, Bug, again, doesn't really count. Fairy, Fire, Steel, even Ice types in this generation to be able to resist that is very, very nice. Resist Grass types as well on top of that, but at the same time, Grass types not the best this gen. I guess where it struggles is definitely on the offensive side, being unable to really hit water types, hit dragon types, hit fire types particularly hard is going to hurt it in the long run. And also the types that it's strong against, Bug, Grass, Ice, Steel. Only really Steel, I think, in that list is going to be something that you're necessarily that happy to be able to hit offensively. I think it's just, as a defensive type this generation, it's so underrated. And having a good defensive fire type, something like a Moltres comes to mind, and Arcanine even something like Gouging Fire, like it gets so much from that fire typing. I think Fire is actually really good this gen, and a lot of people will sleep on it, thinking, oh, it's weak to rocks. Offensively, it's not great, but I think as a defensive typing, in particular this gen, albeit you do have to run boots on them most weeks. Next up we've got Flying, and I think Flying also goes into useful. There's not a lot going into these top two tiers at the moment, but I guess there's also not a lot going into the bottom ones, but we are coming up to some very polar opposite types coming up. So yeah, Flying I think has had a bigger drop off than maybe any type in the game outside of, I would say, Grass, maybe Psychic. Defensively it's quite nice, able to be immune to ground, but a lot of ground types have that rock coverage that can hit you, and I'd say both Bug and Grass aren't amazing resist to have this generation. Resist to fighting, but again, like, you might get knocked off and then you're taking rocks damage. But at the same time, the types that you're weak to, being electric, ice and rock, only really one of those is a type that's going to be particularly scary. Rock and ice coverage is more of an issue, and that is a little bit more prevalent, I feel like, in this gen than it has been in previous gens, but with the addition of like Ice Spinner in particular to a lot of Mon's movesets. And then like offensively, it's similar to Fire in the sense that you're good against fighting, but you're also good against Bug and Grass, and Bug and Grass are two types that I don't think are particularly good this generation, so fighting being like a useful type. Realistically, I see flying as something that is going to be there for your ground resist or your ground immunity and your fighting resist. There's just better options as a fighting resist. I think both Poison, Ghost and Fairy are all better resist to fighting arguably than flying is nowadays. Ground is like the one big thing that it has. But I think at this point, flying it's a little bit lower than it used to be, that's for sure. Bird spam is still good though. Brave Bird. Also, another thing, if you're on the special side, you're relying on Hurricane. And unless you're Uzi, you're not hitting them. So, yeah, flying I think is a very mediocre typing. People have held flying in high regard in the past. I'm sure that it's still not a terrible typing, but looking across the board, it's definitely nowhere near the level it used to be back in like Gen 6, Gen 7. In contrast, Ghost type is fantastic nowadays. A type that I think more and more people are realizing is actually really helpful for their draft. Hazard spam is huge in this generation, and being able to be immune, or be a spin blocker I guess would be the better way of putting it. Immune to rapid spin, you resist the mortal spin on the one Pokemon that has that. Ghost is just a great defensive typing that also has great offensive capabilities as well. The only two things that it's not going to be able to hit for at least neutral damage is Normal and Dark. Normal is not the most prevalent typing in general, and Dark is a good type, but there's a lot of very strong Ghost types that are able to just break through the Dark types. But I think where it really excels is in its defensive effectiveness. Like, immune to fighting, fantastic. Immune to normal, great. Probably not the best thing. Resist bug, whatever. But it resists poison as well, and poison is a very strong type this generation. Its only weaknesses are to itself and to dark, both of which like you can switch into, you know, something else to be able to deal with. But I think Ghost's defensive capabilities this gen is fantastic. Being a spin blocker as a Terra type as well is also great, albeit I probably wouldn't include that in the list of things that require, or the list of requirements for how good a type is. I just think it's a very, very all-round good type, and the lack of pursuit in the last couple of generations has just made it even stronger. I believe even Foresight and like Odor Sleuth, the abilities that, or the moves that allowed you to hit Ghost types, they're gone from the game as well. So they really went all out on buffing Ghost type, but they just left like Bug in the dust. And conversely, a type that I think has once again fallen off. Like, there's some types that have gone better. This is definitely not one of them. I think Grass has to go into the mostly bad category. Offensively, Grass is terrible. The only things it's good against is ground, rock, and water. Ground and water are nice. That is very good. Rock is not a good type itself, but it is weak to bug. It is weak to fire, it's weak to flying, it's weak to ice, it's weak to poison. Not to mention, offensively, again, it's similar to Bug, it just has nothing that it can hit. It doesn't hit dragon types, it doesn't hit fire types, it doesn't hit poison types, it doesn't hit steel types. Like, those are four pretty big types to not be able to hit, and for the most part, grass types don't have the offensive capabilities in its coverage moves to be able to actually be able to hit those as well. So, although grass has got some nice resists in like ground and water, and electric as well, there's just very few mons that are actually deemed like good enough, especially with just solely grass typing, to be even like more than 5 points. I'm thinking Rillaboom and Ogerpon Teal is like the only two grass types that are actually like really viable, and they're really viable because of A, having great utility and really good stats in Ogerpon's case, and a great ability plus a good priority move, the ability to knock off and U-turn in Rillaboom, Also sets up other mons like Hawlucha, Sneasler to be more effective. It's great for like pairings with Heatran and stuff like that. So I think the only good grass types realistically are going to be like those top two, and then things like Zarude. It's just such a weak type offensively and not a good enough type defensively for me to really feel like grass type is always necessary. It does work nicely in defensive cores, but at the same time I don't think it's always because of the grass type so much as its secondary type, or it's just its ability to switch into things that your water types don't want to switch into, or your fire types don't want to switch into. So yeah. Next up we got ground, and we'll go up to always have. I think ground is a fantastic type, very similar to the types around it like dark. It does have its weaknesses by all means, but offensively you're able to hit some of the strongest types, or some of the best types in the game, and poison, steel, even fire and electric are two good types to be able to hit super effectively. The resistances is where it mainly is though, or like the types that resist it. Bug, grass, flying. Two of those types are in the bottom two tiers, and flying is at the bottom of the tier above that. So I think ground types are fantastic, and realistically flying types you're always going to have that rock move. You might even have like a secondary stab that can hit the flying type. So ground types are really, really strong offensively. I think defensively they're not bad. Weak to grass, ice, water is just, you know, water's a good or is a bad type to be weak to, but the rest are fine. And it's electric resist or electric immunity is always really, really helpful to have, and I do think you need that on every draft, because as I said earlier when I was talking about electric, I had a draft where I'll go because as I was saying earlier, I had that draft without a ground type and it was pain. Switching into volt switches and just getting constant loss of momentum was a nightmare. So I think that ground types are very much a necessity to have this gen. They aren't god tier. I think they're probably above dark types, I would say, but they're very, very close. So yeah, ground type I think is very, very solid, and unfortunately a type that I think is a little bit less solid, I'm going to put it behind grass in fact, it's going to be ice. They do ice so dirty. One resist being itself. Not helpful. It's weak to fighting, fire, steel and rock, three of which are very good, or two of which are very good offensive typings. Rock is a pretty good offensive typing, and steel, most ice types don't have a whole lot to be able to break through a steel type. It's also unable to hit water type unless you're a special mon with freeze dry, and even then the amount of ice types that are special, that have good special attack stats, as well as being able to outspeed other mons is very, very limited. Like Kyurem is probably the only really top tier ice type that is able to hit water types with freeze dry. So yeah, ice type offensively, I think ice types actually offensively are really good, and I think if you're going to get a good offensive ice type, then you're fine. If you get like a Baxcalibur or a Kyurem, for example. But if you're not going to get one of those like top tier ones, maybe a Alola Ninetales comes in because of its utility, maybe a Abomasnow because of its utility again. You're probably looking down into like the lower tiers for picking up an ice type, and then it's probably going to come to maybe 1, possibly 2 games a season. And that's just, it's not great. I think in terms of ice type, you've got very limited options on what are good, and after that, you're probably not going to pick one up. Now we've got the most boring type in the game. However, it's not a bad type. I think it does go to the bottom of useful, but I think normal type has just got its good values and it's got its bad values in this generation. Of course, being immune to Ghost is great in a generation where Ghost is actually really strong. The only issue is that you're also unable to hit the Ghost type, which kind of sucks unless you have that coverage to be able to hit it. Not a lot of normal types do get knockoff this gen as far as I'm aware, but a lot of them do get EQ, so albeit you are unable to hit with your stab against rock types and steel types, you can EQ them. And fighting type being your only weakness means that you are neutral to basically the entire game, and that's always going to be helpful, especially because normal types tend to be on the bulkier side. So yeah, I think having a normal type is something that you want to pick up. A lot of the good, or a lot of low tier normals are actually pretty good in that situation. A lot of them have like at least decent enough bulk that is worth picking up, just so you have that ghost immunity more so than anything else. But it will also give you a bunch of neutralities that acts as a blanket switch in to a lot of mons, and that's why I love Greedent so much. It's because it's able to switch into so many things, pop its cheek pouch, get back up to full, and immediately do something. So yeah, I think normal is a very useful type, but I think a lot of people will also put it down a little bit lower. But a type that I don't think anyone's putting down lower, not in this generation, is going to be Poison. And Poison, I think, is right towards the top. It's not quite God tier, it's almost there though, because this generation is so helpful to have. It's one of the few types that is able to check fairies and offensively be able to scare them out, because it does have very good options with Gong Shot, Sludge Wave, Sludge Bomb to be able to immediately threaten fairy types no matter what. And defensively has got great resists in fairy, fighting, and obviously to itself in poison. Bug and grass on the biggest deals. It's only weak to 2 types as well, psychic and ground. And ground is a good type, psychic I think has fallen off quite a bit. So defensively, poison has come up as a really big, very strong defensive type, with fairies being as prominent as they are, or as devastating as they are. I think poison is the premier defensive type to offensively then be able to cause them to switch out. The downside to it though is that you're only able to hit fairy and grass super effectively, which is not, fairy's nice, grass is whatever, and you can't hit steals. You've got a bunch of resists, and like quite good resists as well in ghost, ground, and poison in particular. So offensively not the greatest type, but I think there's so many things that poison types can do this generation that no other ones can do for the most part, in like set up toxic spikes. Grounded poison to be able to eat those toxic spikes as well is always going to be such a huge thing for your draft, otherwise you will almost definitely have to run boots most weeks on all 6 of your mons. And obviously toxic is much less prominent than it used to be, but basically every poison type gets it, it will always hit. So yeah. Next up we got Psychic, and I think unfortunately Psychic probably falls down into like useful this generation. In the past they used to be much stronger, but I don't know whether it's the power creep on mons that are able to resist Psychic, or whether it's just like the lack of good Psychics in this generation. Man, does Psychic feel underwhelming now. It used to be like one of those really spammable types. Like Gen 1 it was broken, they introduced Dark types, which is part of the reason why Psychics aren't so good. Another reason is because of Steel types. Also it finds it really hard to hit itself, hits Psychic types, because a lot of Psychic types are especially defensive, so they tend to find themselves checked by themselves. That makes any sense. But it does have two good types that it's strong against in fighting and poison, which I think might actually push it up a little bit, at least above fire. I think the Psychic is just a mediocre type. I think it is literally like a slap bang in the middle kind of type. It's got 2 good resists to fighting and Psychic, but they're also not the best at checking those types in my opinion. And then it's weak to Ghost, which has become a really good type. It's weak to Dark, so it's weak to Knockoff. It's weak to U-Turn as well, which, the combination of being weak to Knockoff and U-Turn is a little bit rough, and you don't gain much for having a Psychic type. Third from last type, it's going to be Rock. And boy is Rock bad. It's such a terrible typing. It sucks so much that they have these typings down here that are so bad. I think Ice, Rock, and Bug for the longest time, despite them buffing both Rock and Ice types at some point during the game, and Ice types now get the Snow buff, defensive Snow buff. They got Aurora Veil. Rock types get the special defense buff in the Sandstorm. It's such a bad type. Defensively, it's just weak to too many good types. Fighting, ground, steel, water. 4 fantastic types. Resists, the only really like standout one is poison, and even then like other types just check poison better. Other types just check fire better. Other types check flying better. It's just so sad. And like offensively, it's a pretty good type offensively. Like not many, like it's not able to hit fighting, ground, and steel, which sucks because they're all very good types in their own, on their own behalf. But there is the ability to hit quite a lot of things for like neutral damage with Stone Edge. Stone Edge is a very strong move, but then they decided that Rock types are just going to have like basically no moves that actually are accurate. Yes, you have Mighty Cleave, which is why Iron Boulder is actually an offensive threat, but the main reason it is because it also has close combat and it has Earthquake, so you can hit those other things. It's got stab psychic moves, so it can hit the fighting type. Like, there's so many other things that need to be tagged on, like Tyranitar sets up the sand. It has knockoff, it hits hard, it has potential setup, it has rocks. Like, it requires so much for a rock type to actually be viable that at this point, unless you're picking up like Iron Boulder, Terrakion, Tyranitar, I don't think there's really any reason to pick up a rock type. Next up we got Steel, and Steel goes up into the always have. I do think that it's a very good defensive typing, but it's not as good as it used to be. Yes, those resists are great. Like, there's so many resists, which is fantastic. Immunity to poison, really, really good in a generation where poison is so good. I know Fairy is fantastic this gen. My main issue is that Steel types struggle so much to hit things offensively. Unless you're like a Sizzle, where you have Technician boosted attacks. If you're a King Gambit that has stupid ability, you're an Excadrill that is able to double its speed in sand. Offensively, there's not a lot of great Steel types, and a lot of them are also physically defensive. So the resists to things like Fairy, the resists to things like Dragon, to Psychic, they're actually harder to resist when you are hit so hard on especially defensive side, that a lot of those resists become like pseudo resists and you're still going to take a big chunk. On top of that, you're weak to fighting and ground, which are two very solid types in this generation. You offensively, you can't hit water types, you can't hit steel types, you can't hit electric types very hard, you can't hit fire types very hard. Like, all four of those are pretty unfortunate because you do want to hit those this generation, and I don't think there's any steel types, correct me if I'm wrong, that are able to get like access to Toxic. Not many of them have access to U-turn or Volt Switch to be able to pivot out. So you're kind of in a situation where, yes, it's a good defensive type, but a lot of them are very passive. I think they're a little bit worse this generation. It may also be because the top tier steel types from previous gen aren't in this generation. Things like Kartana, things like Celesteela, they're not around. So therefore still kind of drops off a little bit. Still a great typing, don't get me wrong. I do think you want it on pretty much every draft. But at the same time, yeah, steel types had a bit of a drop off. I think they do still go above like those two. I think it's probably like in the middle of always have. It's a top 5 type, I reckon, at this point. But it's certainly not as good as it used to be. And with that, we have one type left. And what a type it is. Water type, in my opinion, is the best type in the game. And it may be a bit of a hot take. They have so much going for them in this generation. They've got great resists in water, steel, fire, are all great. The main thing is that it's only weak to electric and grass. Grass is not a good type this generation, and electric is a middling type. Defensively, really, really solid. Offensively, being able to hit fire and ground types is really nice. Dragon, water, and grass are the only 3 types that resist it, and 2 of which are weak to the almost always available ice move that waters can have. You got Scold, you got Flip Turn, you got Aqua Jet. Like, you got 3 moves that you can almost entirely run like an all-water moveset on your water types and be fine. Run 1 coverage move for the dragon and grass types and just set. Defensively, water has got amazing options. Offensively, water's got arguably even better options. Like, there's so many good water types in this generation. Fairy is an incredible type, and I think it is often seen as the best. But I think water has just that little edge over it, with that it's got a spammable move like Moonblast, Scold, both spammable. You got Stab, Switch Initiative, and Flip Turn that often, like, it's pretty much unresisted, or not unresisted, but it's impossible to block for the most part. It's going to be only Water Absorb, Storm Drain mons that are able to do that, Dry Skin. Honestly, I'm happy with this. I think this is fine, and I know there's people who probably will disagree. If that's the case, fantastic. Discourse is always going to be appreciated. Let's just keep it civil, let's keep it friendly, no shit talking each other, unless it's memes, of course. We're always down for some good memes. And like I said at the start, make sure to go and check out J. Ricky and Gentleman Thomas's video. There's very much some differences here. I know we tiered things slightly different. They went on whether or not you should draft it or not, but I feel like at this point, types are far less important to draft than roles are. You pretty much always want to have those top 2 tiers, and then the useful tier, you probably do want to get like a variance of those ones. You don't have to have all of them, but I think you can build a very good team, and Joey proved this with PPL Season 1. He didn't have a fairy type on his draft. His fairy type was Terra Delphox, and he still won that league. And granted, it's Joey, he's an exceptional player. It did prove that you don't have to have everything, as long as you're able to make the team that you've got function correctly. But I'm waffling now. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. We're going to do more frequent tier lists. We're going to have more Wi-Fi battles, not just Draft League. We're going to do some like actual tier Wi-Fi battles. I want to use a UU team with Superior, for example. And yeah, I'm going to get out of here. Until the next one, have a great day, guys. Peace.